The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly under a sky bleached white by heat that could kill a man before he realized he was dying. Ezra McAllister had chosen this particular patch of nowhere precisely because it asked no questions about a man's past and offered no promises about his future. Here, among the saguaro cacti and scattered bones of creatures that learned too late about the desert's unforgiving nature, a man could disappear so completely that even his own name began to feel like something borrowed from a stranger. At 64, Ezra carried his years like scars, visible to anyone who looked closely, but wore with the kind of resigned dignity that came from surviving more than his share of violence and loss. His hair had gone white as bone years ago, and his weathered hands told stories of gunfights, grave digging, and the thousand small cruelties that marked a man who'd lived too long on the wrong side of civilization's fragile boundaries. The campfire he built each evening served no practical purpose. The desert nights were warm enough that a man could sleep comfortably under the stars without additional heat. But fire was one of the few things that separated humans from animals, and Ezra had begun to worry that spending too much time alone in the wilderness might cost him the last threads that connected him to his own humanity. He'd been living this way for 3 months now, ever since the incident in Tucson that had convinced him it was time to disappear permanently. The details didn't matter anymore. They never really had. Just another dusty street, another young fool convinced that killing Ezra McAllister would make him famous, another grave that needed digging when the smoke cleared. But something about that particular death had broken something inside Ezra that had been cracking for years, had finally convinced him that the world would be better off if he simply vanished into the desert and let the wind scatter his bones alongside all the other forgotten men who'd chosen this as their final resting place. His camp was sparse by necessity and design. A bedroll, a coffee pot, enough supplies to last a week if he was careful with portions, and the twin Colt .45s that he carried for so long they felt like extensions of his own hands. The guns were clean and loaded, not because he expected trouble in this godforsaken wasteland, but because 40 years of survival had taught him that trouble had a way of finding men like him regardless of how far they ran. As the sun settled toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that would have taken Martha's breath away if she'd lived to see them, Ezra performed his evening rituals with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that routine was often the only thing standing between a man and madness. Water the horse, a tough little Mustang mare named Sarah who'd been with him longer than any human companion. Check the perimeter for signs of predators or unwelcome visitors. Build a fire and prepare what passed for supper in a land where every calorie counted and waste could mean death. Tonight's meal was jerky and hardtack, washed down with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The same combination he'd been eating for weeks because variety was a luxury that men in his position couldn't afford. As he chewed the leathery meat and watched sparks rise from his fire toward stars that seemed close enough to touch, Ezra found himself thinking about names, his own, which felt increasingly foreign on his tongue, and the names of all the men he'd killed, which came back to him with uncomfortable clarity in the desert silence. Billy Morrison, 19 years old, quick with a gun but not quick enough. That was El Paso, 1887. Frank Dalton, veteran of too many range wars, finally met someone faster. That was Santa Fe, spring of 89. The list went on, a catalog of young men who died believing that reputation was worth more than life, that being known as a man who killed Ezra McAllister would somehow transform them into something larger than the small, frightened boys they'd been before they strapped on their guns. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become exactly what they wanted to become, and it had cost him everything worth having. Martha, who'd left him when the killing became too much to bear. His brother Robert, who'd stopped writing letters after Ezra's name started appearing in newspapers alongside words like notorious and deadly. The chance for children, for a normal life, for the kind of peaceful old age that other men took for granted. Now, sitting alone beside his fire with nothing but desert wind for company, Ezra wondered if this was how it ended for men like him. Not in a blaze of gunfire and glory, but in slow dissolution, becoming one with a landscape they'd chosen over human connection. Maybe that was justice of a sort, a final accounting that balanced all the lives he'd taken with a gradual surrender of his own. He was reaching for his coffee cup when he heard it, a sound so soft he might have missed it if the night wind hadn't chosen that moment to die away completely. Footsteps, light and careful, approaching his camp from the darkness beyond his fire's glow. Not the heavy tread of men looking for trouble, but something else entirely. The barely audible whisper of bare feet moving across sand with the kind of practiced stealth that spoke of people who'd learned that survival often depended on not being noticed. Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he remained perfectly still, listening as the footsteps circled his camp at a respectful distance, neither approaching nor retreating, as if their owners were trying to decide whether the old man by the fire represented safety or danger. "I know you're out there," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the desert silence. "If you're looking for trouble, you've come to the wrong place. If you're looking for help—" He paused, surprised by his own words. "Well, I suppose that depends on what kind of help you need." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, they emerged from the darkness like shadows taking shape. 5 children, all of them Native American, all of them so thin and travel-worn that Ezra felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of them. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a girl with long black hair and dark eyes that held depths of wariness and intelligence that made Ezra's throat tighten with recognition. Behind her came 4 others. 2 boys who might have been twins, another girl slightly younger than the first, and bringing up the rear, a child so small that Ezra couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl beneath the oversized clothes and carefully neutral expression. They stood at the edge of his firelight like wild animals ready to bolt at the first sign of threat, studying him with the kind of attention that came from children who'd learned that reading adult intentions could be a matter of life and death. "Well," Ezra said softly, setting down his coffee cup and raising his hands to show they were empty, "looks like I've got visitors." The children remained frozen at the edge of Ezra's firelight, caught between hunger that had driven them to approach a stranger's camp and fear that kept them ready to vanish back into the desert darkness. Ezra could see the calculation in their dark eyes, weighing the risk of trusting a white man against the desperation that had brought them this far from wherever they had started. "You hungry?" Ezra asked gently, keeping his voice low and his movements slow as he reached for his saddlebags. "Got some hardtack and jerky." "Not much, but it's better than nothing." The oldest girl, clearly the leader of the small band, exchanged quick glances with the others before stepping slightly closer to fire. "We do not take charity from white men," she said in careful English, her accent marking her as someone for whom this was a second language learned by necessity rather than choice. "Good," Ezra replied, pulling dried meat and hard biscuits from his supplies. "Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering trade." "We have nothing to trade," one of the boys said, his voice carrying the proud defiance of someone who'd been taught that admitting need was a form of weakness. "Sure you do," Ezra said, arranging food on a clean cloth and setting it between himself and the children. "You got stories?" "Been a long time since I heard any new stories, and these desert nights get mighty quiet for a man with nothing but his own thoughts for company." It was a graceful fiction that allowed the children to accept food without surrendering their dignity, and Ezra could see them recognizing it for what it was, an adult's way of helping without making them feel like beggars. Slowly, carefully, they moved closer to the fire, settling into positions that kept them ready to run, but allowed them to share the warmth and light that Ezra offered. "I am called Morning Light," the eldest girl said as she tore a piece of hardtack into smaller portions to share with the others. "These are my cousins, Running Fox and Swift Arrow." She indicated the twin boys, Little Dove, she nodded toward the younger girl, and Quiet Thunder. The smallest child looked up at the sound of their name, and Ezra realized from the delicate features that this was indeed a girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. "Ezra McAllister," he replied, then felt a moment of confusion as he realized he'd given his real name for the first time in months. Something about these children had stripped away the careful anonymity he'd built around himself, had made him remember what it felt like to be a person rather than just a reputation with a gun attached. "You are a gunfighter," Morning Light observed, her eyes taking in the worn grips of his Colts, the careful way he positioned himself to have clear lines of sight in all directions. "We have heard stories of such men." Ezra admitted, "Lately, I've been trying to figure out what else I might be good for." The children ate in careful silence, making the meager rations last while they studied their unexpected host. Ezra found himself doing the same, noting details that told stories about their recent travels. Clothes that had once been good but were now patched and travel-stained, moccasins worn thin from long walking, the kind of careful alertness that came from children who'd learned that safety was always temporary. "How long have you been traveling?" Ezra asked when they'd finished eating. 12 days, Morning Light replied, "since the soldiers came to our village." The words carried weight that made Ezra's chest tighten with recognition. He'd heard enough stories about army pacification campaigns to understand what had likely happened. Another incident where nervous young officers had decided that peaceful Apache were still Apache, and therefore a threat that needed to be eliminated. "Family?" Ezra asked gently. "Gone," Swift Arrow said simply, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of someone too young to have learned such hard truths. "All gone. We hid in the brush by the river," Little Dove added quietly. "Watched the soldiers burn everything. Waited until they left, then we ran," Morning Light finished, "because there was nothing left to stay for." Ezra absorbed this information, understanding that he was looking at the sole survivors of what was probably being reported in territorial newspapers as a successful engagement against hostile Apache forces. 5 children, the oldest barely 12, carrying the weight of their people's destruction, and try to stay alive in a desert that killed grown men with decades of experience. "Where you headed?" Ezra asked. "South," Morning Light said vaguely, "to relatives across the Great River." Mexico, Ezra realized. Probably 300 miles of desert, mountains, and territory crawling with cavalry patrols looking for exactly refugees like these children. It was possible they might make it. Apache children learn survival skills that most adults never mastered, but the odds were brutally against them. "That's hard country between here and there," Ezra said carefully, "especially for folks traveling alone." "We are not alone," Running Fox said with fierce pride. "We have each other." "Yes," Ezra agreed, seeing something in the boy's defiance that reminded him of himself at that age, when the world had first shown him a capacity for casual cruelty. "Yes, you do." As the fire burned lower and the children began to show signs of the exhaustion they'd been fighting, Ezra found himself facing a decision that would define whatever remained of his life. He could send them on their way in the morning with what supplies he could spare, wish them luck, and return to the business of forgetting his own name in the desert silence. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the kind of decision that had kept him alive through 4 decades of violence. Or he could do something that went against every instinct that had preserved his life, but felt like the first right thing he'd contemplated in years. "You can sleep by my fire tonight," Ezra said quietly. "Desert gets cold after midnight, and a fire's better shared anyway." Morning Light looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 12-year-old face. "And in the morning?" "In the morning. We'll see what the morning brings," Ezra replied. "Sometimes the best plans are the ones you make when you can see where you're going." As the children settled into sleep around the dying fire, curled together like a litter of puppies seeking warmth and comfort, Ezra remained awake, keeping watch over 5 strangers who had somehow become his responsibility in the space of a few hours. He'd spent 64 years learning that attachment led to loss, that caring about people was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. But watching Little Dove's small hand reach out in sleep to touch Quiet Thunder's arm, seeing the way the twins positioned themselves to shield the girls from the night wind, Ezra felt something stirring in his chest that he thought was dead and buried along with all his other hopes for a normal life. Maybe redemption didn't come through grand gestures or dramatic transformations. Maybe it came through small choices made in the darkness, when nobody was watching except the stars and a man's own conscience. Tomorrow would bring decisions he wasn't ready to make, challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time in months, Ezra McAllister felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. Ezra woke to the smell of something cooking, a rich, earthy scent that had no place in his usual breakfast routine of cold jerky and yesterday's coffee. He opened his eyes to find Morning Light tending a small fire she'd built from the coals of the previous night's blaze, roasting what looked like small tubers that she must have gathered while he slept. "Desert potatoes," she explained, noting his curious expression. "My grandmother taught me to find them. They grow deep, where there's water the eyes cannot see." The other children were awake as well, moving to what was clearly an established morning routine. Quiet thunder gathering dried wood for fire, the twins checking their meager possessions, Little Dove braiding her long hair with strips of leather that had seen better days. They worked with the efficient cooperation of people who understood that survival depended on everyone contributing what they could. "You should have woken me," Ezra said, rising stiffly from his bedroll. "Standing watch is supposed to be my job." "We are accustomed to watching," Morning Light replied simply. "And you are accustomed to sleeping alone." It seemed fair. Ezra accepted one of the roasted tubers, surprised by its nutty flavor and the way it seemed to satisfy hunger more completely than his usual trail rations. "Where did you learn to speak English so well?" "Mission school," Morning Light said, a shadow crossing her face. "Before the soldiers decided that teaching Apache children was unnecessary." Ezra understood the implication. Another casualty of the territory's shifting policies toward Native Americans. Another bridge between cultures destroyed by men who found fear easier than understanding. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the simple meal while the desert around them began to wake up. Birds called from hidden perches in the saguaro, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote announced the end of night with a long, mournful howl that seemed to carry across the empty landscape like a prayer. "Tell me about your relatives in Mexico," Ezra said as they finished eating. "How will you find them?" Morning Light and the twins exchanged glances that spoke of conversations held while Ezra slept. "Our great-uncle walks with eagles, leads a band that moves between the mountains south of the Great River. If we can reach the old trading post at San Miguel, people there will know where to find him." "San Miguel," Ezra repeated, calculating distances and routes in his head. "That's a hard ride, even for a man with a good horse and full supplies. For children on foot, we are stronger than we look," Running Fox said defensively. "And we know the old paths, the places where white men do not go." "I'm sure you do," Ezra replied gently. "But strength and knowledge don't make bullets bounce off, and there are cavalry patrols between here and the border that shoot first and ask questions of the corpses." The children absorbed this soberly, understanding that he was stating facts rather than trying to discourage them. They'd already seen enough of white man's justice to harbor no illusions about their chances if they were caught. "What do you suggest?" Morning Light asked, her tone making it clear that she was genuinely asking for advice rather than expecting him to solve their problems. Ezra found himself facing a moment of decision that felt larger than the simple question it appeared to be. He could offer them supplies, directions, warnings about the dangers ahead. The kind of help that would ease his conscience without fundamentally changing his situation. Or he could do something that would transform him from a man running from his past into someone actively shaping his future. "I suggest," Ezra said slowly, "that 5 children might have better luck traveling with someone who knows the country and can discourage the kind of attention that gets people shot." The silence that followed his words stretched like a wire drawn, the breaking point. The children stared with expressions that cycled through surprise, hope, suspicion, and calculation, while Ezra wondered if he just made the smartest decision of his life or signed his own death warrant. "You would travel with us?" Little Dove asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even though we are Apache? Even though helping us could bring trouble?" "Especially because you're Apache," Ezra replied. "And especially because helping you is likely to bring trouble. I've spent the last 3 months trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Maybe this is the answer." Morning Light studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned that adult promises were often worth less than the breath used to make them. "Why?" she asked simply. It was a fair question, and one Ezra wasn't sure he could answer completely honestly even to himself. "Because I've spent 40 years being the kind of man that mothers warn their children about," he said finally. "Maybe it's time I tried being the kind of man that children can trust. This will be dangerous for you," Swift Arrow pointed out with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned to calculate risks early. "If soldiers find you with us, then they'll find a man with 5 children who are under his protection," Ezra finished. "And they'll have to decide whether they want to explain to their superiors why they shot an old gunfighter who was trying to do something decent for once in his life." The children conferred among themselves in rapid Apache, voices low but intense as they debated something that was clearly more complex than simple acceptance or refusal. Ezra couldn't understand the words, But he could read the body language. Morning Light arguing for caution, the twins pushing for acceptance, Little Dove and Quiet Thunder looking back and forth between their older cousins like spectators at a tennis match. Finally, Morning Light turned back to him. If you travel with us, you become responsible for us. In Apache law, this creates obligations that do not end when the journey ends. What kind of obligations? The obligation to protect us, as if we were your own children. The obligation to speak for us when we cannot speak for ourselves. The obligation to remember us in your prayers and your stories until the day you die. Ezra felt the weight of those words settling around him like a blanket. Heavy, warm, and utterly transformative. And what obligations do I get in return? Morning Light smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and the expression transformed her entire face from that of a weary refugee into something approaching the child she should have been allowed to be. The obligation to let us protect you when you need protection. The obligation to listen when we speak wisdom. And the obligation to remember that you are no longer alone in the world. As Ezra looked around the circle of young faces watching him with expressions that mixed hope and wariness in equal measure, he felt something crack open in his chest that had been frozen solid for more years than he cared to count. "Well then," he said, extending his hand toward Morning Light in a gesture that would seal their compact, "I guess we'd better get started toward Mexico." 3 days into their journey south, Ezra discovered that traveling with 5 Apache children was like trying to herd mountain goats while riding blindfolded through a thunderstorm. They moved through the desert with a fluid efficiency that made his own wilderness skills look clumsy by comparison, appearing and disappearing among the rocks and cacti with an ease that would have been supernatural if he hadn't understood that it was simply the result of generations of survival training passed down through bloodlines that predated his people's arrival in this land by thousands of years. Morning Light had taken over navigation duties without discussion, leading them along paths that existed more in memory and tradition than in any visible trace on the ground. The twins ranged ahead and behind like scout wolves, reading signs in the dirt and wind that Ezra was only beginning to recognize. Little Dove and Quiet Thunder stayed close to the main group, but their eyes constantly scanned the horizon with the kind of alertness that came from children who'd learned that danger could approach from any direction. "Your horse is lame," Running Fox announced as they paused for their midday rest in the shade of a boulder formation that provided both shelter and concealment from any watchers who might be scanning the desert for signs of movement. Ezra examined Sarah's left front hoof, finding the small stone wedge between shoe and frog that was causing her to favor the leg. "Good eye," he said, working the pebble free with his knife. "How long has she been limping?" "Since this morning," Swift Arrow replied. "She hides it well, but the rhythm was wrong. Why didn't you say something sooner?" "We were watching to see if you would notice," Morning Light explained matter-of-factly. "A man who does not pay attention to his horse's pain is not someone who can be trusted to pay attention to children's needs." It was a test, Ezra realized. One of probably many that these young survivors would use to determine whether their unlikely guardian was worthy of the trust they were cautiously beginning to place in him. The thought that he might have failed such a basic measure of competence made his stomach tighten with something approaching shame. "What other tests have I been taking without knowing it?" Ezra asked. "Many," Little Dove said with a kind of brutal honesty that only children could deliver without malice. "But you are passing most of them." "Most of them." "You share food equally," Quiet Thunder listed, speaking for the first time since their journey had begun. "You do not touch us without permission. You listen when we speak. You do not make promises you cannot keep." "But," Ezra prompted, sensing there was more to their evaluation. "But you still think like a white man," Morning Light said gently. "You see the desert as something to cross rather than something to live with. You plan for where you are going instead of paying attention to where you are. And that's a problem because the desert will teach you what you need to know, but only if you are willing to be taught," Swift Arrow explained. "And because the soldiers who are hunting us think like white men too, which means they can predict a white man's choices." Ezra absorbed his criticism, understanding that it came not from hostility, but from a genuine desire to keep their small group alive. "So, teach me," he said simply. What followed was an education unlike anything Ezra had experienced in 64 years of living. The children showed him how to read the landscape for signs of water, how to identify plants that could provide food or medicine, how to move across open ground without creating the kind of disturbance that watchful eyes could spot from miles away. More importantly, they began teaching him to think in terms of harmony rather than conquest, of adaptation rather than domination. Water flows around obstacles. Morning Light explained as they navigate a particularly challenging stretch of broken terrain. It does not try to break through them. It finds a path that already exists. And when there is no path, Ezra asked, "Then water waits." Little Dove said seriously, "Water is patient. Water remembers that everything changes, even the hardest stone." By the evening of their fourth day together, Ezra found himself seeing the desert through different eyes, not as an empty wasteland to be endured, but as a living entity with its own rhythms and rules, its own harsh but sustainable logic. The children moved through this landscape like notes in a song, each step part of a larger harmony that included wind and stone and the subtle music of survival. That night, as they made camp in a hidden canyon where a trickle of spring water supported a small grove of cottonwoods, Ezra realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. He was no longer just a white man who'd offered to help Apache children reach safety. He was becoming part of their story, integrated into the complex web of obligations and loyalties that bound them together as surely as blood or clan membership. "Tell us about your family," Morning Light requested as they shared the evening meal of roasted rabbit that the twins had caught using snares that seemed to materialize from nothing more than grass and patience. "Don't have family," Ezra replied automatically, then stopped as he realized how untrue that statement had become. "At least I didn't used to. Everyone is family," Quiet Thunder said with the certainty of someone who'd been raised to understand that human connections transcended biology. "Sometimes it is a family you are born to. Sometimes it is a family you choose. Sometimes it is a family that chooses you." "Which kind are we?" Little Dove asked, looking directly at Ezra with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face. Ezra considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would carry weight that went beyond simple conversation. "I think," he said finally, "that you're the kind of family that saves a man's soul, whether he deserves saving or not." The children absorbed this with the gravity that Apache culture brought to matters of spiritual significance. Then Swift Arrow smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Ezra had seen from any of them. "Then we are the kind of family that is worth protecting," he said simply, as they settled in for night, with the children arranged around the small fire in patterns that spoke of long practice at shared sleeping. Ezra found himself keeping watch not out of duty or habit, but out of love. It was a revelation that should have terrified him. A man like him loving anyone was dangerous for everyone involved. But instead, it felt like the first completely honest emotion he'd experienced in decades. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the border, and to the cavalry patrols that made crossing a gamble with death as the stakes. But tonight, listening to quiet breathing of 5 children who'd somehow become his responsibility and his redemption, Ezra McAllister felt like he finally understood what he'd been running toward all those years when he thought he was running away. The cavalry patrol appeared on the horizon just after dawn on their 7th day of travel, a line of blue uniforms and dust clouds that stood out against the desert landscape like a wound against healthy skin. Ezra spotted them first, his eyes trained by decades of watching for trouble to recognize danger at distances that might mean the difference between escape and capture. "How many?" Morning Light asked quietly, following his gaze toward the approaching riders. 20, maybe 25, Ezra replied, already calculating odds that weren't encouraging. "Moving fast, like they're following a specific trail." The children exchanged glances that spoke of conversations held in languages older than English, communications that flowed between them like water finding its level. Without discussion, they began implementing what was clearly a well-rehearsed plan for exactly the situation. "We hide," Swift Arrow said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders that would provide concealment, but little real protection if the soldiers decided to search thoroughly. "You continue toward the waterhole. If they question you, you are a prospector heading for the border camps." "I'm not leaving you," Ezra said flatly. "You must," Morning Light insisted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to make life-and-death decisions before most children learned to tie their shoes. 5 Apache children traveling with a white man creates questions that have no safe answers. 1 white man traveling alone is ordinary, forgettable. And if they find you while I'm gone, then we run. Running Fox said simply, "We are fast, and we know places where horses cannot follow. But if you are with us when they find us, we all die." Ezra felt his chest tighten with the familiar weight of impossible choices. Logic dictated that the children were right. His presence would transform them from refugees who might be overlooked into an armed group that represented a clear threat requiring immediate action. But everything in his nature rebelled against the idea of abandoning 5 children to face cavalry soldiers alone. "There's another way," Ezra said suddenly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. "What if I don't leave you? What if instead I make it clear that you're under my protection?" "That is madness," Lil Dove whispered. "Soldiers kill white men who help Apache." "Some soldiers do," Ezra agreed, "but not all soldiers and not all situations, especially when the white man in question has a reputation that makes killing him more trouble than it's worth." Morning light studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read the intentions of a potentially dangerous animal. "You would risk your life for us?" "I would risk my reputation," Ezra corrected, "which is the only thing about me that's ever been worth anything to anybody." Before the children could argue further, Ezra was moving, not toward concealment, but toward open ground where the approaching soldiers couldn't miss him. He positioned himself in clear sight, his hands visible and away from his guns, but his posture carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who'd faced down more dangerous men than these and lived to tell about it. The patrol reached him 10 minutes later, their young lieutenant showing the kind of aggressive certainty that came from officers who'd learned their tactics from books rather than experience. "Hold right there," the lieutenant called, his hand resting on his saber hilt in a gesture meant to establish immediate authority. "Morning, Lieutenant," Ezra replied pleasantly, as if meeting armed patrols in the middle of nowhere was a regular part of his routine. "Beautiful day for a ride." "State your name and business in this area," the lieutenant demanded, clearly not in the mood for pleasantries. "Ezra McAllister," Ezra said, noting how several of the enlisted men straightened in their saddles at the name. "And my business is my own, unless you've got some legal authority to question free citizens going about their lawful affairs." The lieutenant's face flushed red above his carefully maintained mustache. "I have authority to question anyone I deem suspicious, Mr. McAllister. An unknown gunfighter traveling alone in Apache territory strikes me as highly suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" Ezra asked mildly. "Last I checked, riding through territorial land wasn't against any law, federal or local. We're tracking Apache renegades who attacked a settlement 3 days ago," the lieutenant replied. "Killed an entire family, including women and children. You see anything that might help us find the animals responsible?" Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized a familiar pattern. Another incident that would justify whatever violence these soldiers were planning to inflict on whatever Apache they happened to find. "Can't say I have, Lieutenant. What did these renegades look like?" "Like all the rest of them," the lieutenant spat. "Savage, murderous, and in need of permanent pacification." It was exactly the kind of attitude that had created 5 orphaned children hiding in the rocks behind him, and Ezra felt his famous temper beginning to stir despite his efforts to remain calm. "Well," Ezra said carefully, "if I see any murderous savages, I'll be sure to let you know. Of course, I've found that murderous savages come in all colors, and some of the worst ones I've met were wearing uniforms remarkably similar to yours." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Ezra could see the lieutenant calculating whether his 25 men were enough to take down a legendary gunfighter without suffering casualties that would be difficult to explain to his superiors. "You're walking a dangerous line, McAllister," the lieutenant said finally. "I've been walking dangerous lines my whole life, son," Ezra replied, "and I'm still here while most of the men who thought they could intimidate me are feeding worms in unmarked graves." The standoff stretched like a wire drawn to breaking point. 25 nervous soldiers facing one old man who radiated the kind of casual deadliness that made smart people think twice about escalating confrontations. In the end, it was a lieutenant sergeant who broke the tension. "Sir," the sergeant said quietly, We should be moving if we want to reach the border before dark. The lieutenant nodded reluctantly, clearly understanding that pursuing this confrontation would likely cost him more men than he could afford to lose. This isn't over, McAllister. It never is, Ezra agreed pleasantly. Have a nice day, Lieutenant, as the patrol rode away toward the south. Ezra remained in position until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally, understanding how close they'd all come to violence that would have left bodies scattered across the desert sand. The children emerged from their hiding place like shadows materializing in daylight, their faces showing a mixture of admiration and concern that made Ezra's chest tighten with unfamiliar emotions. That was either very brave or very stupid, Morning Light observed. With me, those two things tend to be the same, Ezra replied. But it worked, and we're all still breathing. For now, Swift Arrow said, scanning the horizon for signs of the patrol's return. But they will remember this encounter. They will remember your name. Good, Ezra said grimly. Let them remember. Let them tell stories about the old gunfighter who stood between them and 5 children they wanted to murder for crimes they didn't commit. Maybe those stories will make the next patrol think twice before they decide that killing Apache children is just another day's work. As they resumed their journey toward the distant border, Ezra understood that something had changed in their relationship. He was no longer just a guardian helping refugees reach safety. He had become their protector in the truest sense, someone willing to stake his reputation and his life on their right to exist in a world that had already decided they were expendable. It was a dangerous transformation, one that would make him enemies among people who'd previously been merely indifferent to his existence. But looking at the faces of 5 children who were learning to trust him with their lives, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do.